Coming up, the New York Football Giants have big decisions to make on both sides of the ball, with Xavier McKinney and Saquon Barkley featured among them. But will Joe Schoen need to make more difficult choices about spending on the market versus investing in-house? We break down the possibilities coming up next. Yes, my friends. It is OGP, the One Giant podcast, where you know that we are your hosts. Over here, Adam Armbrecht. Over there, the healthy, the wealthy, the wise, Mr. Andrew Makowitz, as we dive in on scenarios that we've put the footprints in the sand over the last few weeks, Andy. But now, as we get kind of an update around Saquon Barkley's situation and what that could look like, we can finally plant some flags here about if we would, why we would, and whether or not it would be successful to invest in-house or outside.
Yeah, it feels like an interesting time for us to talk about this. It feels pretty timely too. I think Paul Schwartz came out and said that the Giants are unlikely to use the franchise tag on Saquon Barkley, which is kind of interesting that they're talking about it so early on in the process. I know the window's open; they have a couple weeks to be able to do it. What were your initial thoughts when you heard that, Adam?
I just think that it makes sense. You can look at it from a couple of standpoints. One, we know the increase, right? 20% bump on the second year tag potentially for Saquon Barkley. So if you rewind to last year, well, the Giants were willing to do the 23 million fully guaranteed 2-year contract. Saquon didn't want that. So if you come forward a year later, even though Saquon, had another solid season, not as impressive as the first year back, from a pure business standpoint, from a pure value of position, why would the Giants, and Saquon Barkley doesn't want it either, but why would the Giants sit here and say, yeah, we'll go ahead and hit you with 12.1 million fully locked in money? I think that right now it's, hey, what does a long-term deal look like? 3 seasons potentially. How do we soften the blow of the cap hit this year and keep you here long-term? And now it just comes down to whether or not Saquon Barkley is going to adjust what his expectations were going back from a year ago, or feel like I'm ready to go to the market. My instinct here is that whether or not Saquon wants to stay here and whether or not the Giants want to keep him here, that I think both sides are at the point of, it kind of be really nice if somebody else offered you like 13.5 million a year. You get paid. We get to say, well, that's just too rich for us. We don't have the cap flexibility. And Saquon says, obviously, I'll always have a spot in my heart for the team that drafted me in the New York Football Giants. But we know it's a business, and I'm looking forward to playing for the Chargers or whoever.
It does feel like that. It feels like both sides don't want to end up being the bad guy in the situation, right? Like for Joe Schoen and the Giants, they're like, he's our franchise, face of the franchise. He's the guy we drafted number 2 overall. He's an electric player. He's great in the community. He wants to be a Giant. Everything screams like he should be here for his entire career. He should be the once a Giant, always a Giant kind of player. And then on Saquon Barkley's side, it's like, the Giants drafted me. Like, I love being here. I'm a local guy. I'm from around here. Like, everything makes sense except the money. Except the money and where everyone is currently in their projection of what they want to do. It does seem like if a team offered Saquon Barkley like a 3-year deal for $45 million where he's getting $15 million per year, it feels like it's the best for everyone, right? Like I'm giving the extreme where it's like, the Houston Texans come in and say, let's give him $31 million guaranteed. Let's make sure that he's here for 2 years. Let's give CJ Stroud an explosive weapon. Then the Giants can say, well, guys, look at the contract he got. And then Saquon can turn around and say, guys, look at the contract I just got, right? Yeah. And everyone can kind of break from this amicably. But like, man, Adam, I keep going back to this. And I know that you think that the longer-term deal makes more sense. If you're the Giants specifically, you feel like next season is probably the best it's going to be for Saquon Barkley from here on out. So like getting him on a 1-year rental technically would be the best thing for the organization, trying to like give him 300 carries, send him on his merry way into free agency next year. But I think Saquon and the Giants are looking at each other like, I won't play on this thing, right?
Well, I was going to say that's the other part of this, right? I think, you say neither side has an appetite for the franchise tag. Well, just to clarify, the Giants might have a bit of an appetite for it, but I think this is, and fans may not love this because I've heard this from more national media coverage that maybe aren't as in the weeds on the Giants around this stuff. How could you not use the franchise tag again on him and pay him 12.1 and have him here? There is, I think, a little bit of a push and pull, not only because we know that money gets absolutely put onto the books for 2024, but there is some sense of like, we don't, I know it sounds stupid. It was like, we don't want to totally sour our relationship with Saquon Barkley because guess what? Maybe he goes and plays somewhere else for a couple of years or 3 seasons and then he retires and then he wants to come back and be a part of the organization and all those things. It's rare that guys that leave, like Eli Manning, Giant for life, Strahan, obviously, as well, right? You go down the list of guys that stick around with the organization. They're usually the ones that transition into a post-career relationship. But I think they would welcome him back in because they know that he is that name and he is that cachet. So I think you're at a point here where if you're Joe Schoen, you're kind of selling the idea of, I came in, I wasn't the GM that drafted you. I know you didn't love the tag. I get it. But here's where we are now. And I will do right by you by letting you go to the market. And then sneakily in his little back pocket for Joe Schoen is, and hey, by the way, if you happen to go to market and everyone's kind of offering you 10 to 12-ish million, come on back. Feel free to come on back. We'll sit down. We'll have the talk. We'll give you some nice guaranteed money, and you can retire as a Giant for life because obviously he still offers on-field value for this team, for any team in the league.
Yeah, and Adam, listen, the reason why this is important, obviously the Giants have expressed that they probably won't use it. I still think it's a tool in the background of negotiations until the deadline passes.
Well, I said probably.
I don't.
I didn't say definitely.
Yeah. Until the deadline passes, I don't believe anything. It's just like when the Giants say, "I'm not drafting a quarterback." Until the draft happens and they don't draft a quarterback, I feel the same way about this.
Sure.
But that's why on Twitter we put out a poll just saying the franchise tag for Saquon Barkley is 12.1. The franchise tag for Xavier McKinney is 16.2 million.
Mm-hmm.
As a Giant fan, which one would you rather franchise tag? And the majority of people decided they would rather franchise tag Xavier McKinney at 16.2 rather than Saquon Barkley. And I think both you and I kind of agree that makes sense, right?
Yes, but do I get to use door number 3 on this possibly? Because yes, I agree. If the order is Xavier McKinney first, Saquon Barkley second, if you were going to apply it, and then door number 3 for me would be you don't use the franchise tag on either one of them, right? And there's a different goal with Xavier McKinney here, as we'll talk about coming up, and then again, market and set your own value here for Saquon Barkley. A rare occasion when this happens, usually when you don't have a ton of talent on your roster, you don't use the franchise tag because there's not necessarily a clear need to do that, and we'll understand keeping that money on the books and what 16.2 million could look like. That being the case, there's another factor here, right, Andy? It's, hey, do we want to retain Saquon Barkley? Let's say that we know it's not going to be the tag. And so the average AAV on a deal is going to be something in the neighborhood of $12.5 million maybe a year. You also put forth the idea of if you had to pick between allocating money for either Saquon Barkley or player X, I'll allow Andy to do the introduction, which option would you rather choose there as well, which I think informs an offseason for this team.
Yeah, I think that's the other piece of it. People are like, you got to pay Saquon Barkley. He's a weapon. But this is a salary cap league. It is a hard salary cap league. These decisions don't get made in a vacuum, Adam. When you pay someone a bunch of money, it means you can't pay other people that money. It's not like baseball where like you just pay your way through and just pay extra taxes. There is literally a hard cap that Joe Schoen has to manage. And so I started thinking about it. Let's say it's $12.5 million. I know that might be a little high for some people, but Saquon Barkley, you may want to keep him. Saquon Barkley, it might be a 3-year deal. But let's just say, for argument's sake, the annual contract value is about 12.5.
All right.
There is a free agent on the market by the name of Robert Hunt. I believe he's going to be a guard from the Miami Dolphins, right?
He's there you go. You got there. Sometimes when Andy gets overexcited about these opportunities, he really, it's a dangerous.
Well, he will be. I wanted to make sure that I had his age. He will be 27 years old. I know that this is his first time at getting a crack at free agency. So I was like, is he 25? Is he 26? No, he's 27. He's a little bit older. He had a Pro Football Focus rating of 77 this past year. He is a critical piece to what the run game is in Miami for guys like Raheem Mostert having career years, so on and so forth. Let's say there's a whole host of ranges for guards in the NFL. The all-pros, the Pro Bowlers like Zach Martin, Chris Lindstrom, etc., are making almost $20 million a year. Then you kind of have Ben Powers and other guards that just signed recent deals that are good, not exceptional, not Pro Bowl level players, they're getting anything between 11 and $14 million. So my
Mhm.
question to you is, let's say it's a 3-year, $12.5 million deal for Saquon Barkley, or a 4-year deal for Robert Hunt at the guard position at that same $12.5 million. You put your GM Joe Schoen hat on, Adam.
Mhm.
Where are you allocating the money?
Well, you have to, yeah, this is where again, like you have to spend the money on again, on a position of need across an offensive line that has struggled for the Giants over the last 65 years. Like you have to invest in the area of your team that needs correcting. And you can also, we didn't really talk about this before we started, but you can also associate it with the draft here. And this is going to become, I think, a big factor when we talk about Xavier McKinney as well. Yes, there are some offensive linemen near the top of the draft. Are the Giants going to stay there? Are they going to trade down? So you associate about, well, who might we bring in? And you also probably look back if you're Joe Schoen and say, I have invested in the draft in offensive linemen. And so far, we've had a little bit of a hit or miss or mid round guys that we hope develop and haven't quite gotten there yet, right? So you're looking for proven commodities. And at that point, it's a lot easier to look at Robert Hunt or any maybe number of options on the free agent market and say, hey, I'll invest 10 to 13, $14 million at a key position of need on our offensive line. And then, as we know, when we talk about Saquon Barkley, I can go ahead and look at the fact that we have what? Tony Pollard is going to be on the market. We know that Josh Jacobs is going to be on the market. Other running backs are going to be available. Austin Eckler, DeAndre Swift, Devin Singletary, Zach Moss, AJ Dillon, like all these names. And none of them, some of them rise closer or are further away from Saquon Barkley's talent level. But as is pointed out over on, I want to make sure I get this right, on the New York Post article that was written up by, oh, don't worry, we'll get there in a second, Paul Schwartz. Are any of these guys going to earn $10 million? Right? Like, where are their contracts going to fall? So I hate to say it when discussing Saquon Barkley, but it feels like a no-brainer. If you walked into a room and nobody else is there and they go, it's $12.5 million, Saquon Barkley or Robert Hunt, I would fairly quickly walk to Robert Hunt based on age. They're both the same age, but then the positional value and what the expectations would be over the life of a 3 or 4 year contract for him.
Yeah, I mean that's the tough part. Everyone's like, how could you say Robert Hunt? How could you say it? Look at Saquon Barkley in open space, like he's amazing. And then you think about it, it's like, well, how many times does he actually have open space? Because the offensive line is abysmal. And you start thinking about the allocation of funds and saying, if we paid that money to Robert Hunt and we signed DeAndre Swift for $6.5 to $6 million a year,
Mm-hmm.
do you feel like that's a better setup than signing Saquon Barkley and signing a rotational guard for $6 million? And that's the challenge that Joe Schoen kind of faces, right?
And that's the other problem here too, because Joe Schoen only has to look back to signing Mark Lewinsky, right? And saying like, well, I did that. I did the mid-tier kind of guy, and it kind of got me mid-tier results. And likewise, when you mention a Swift, who I wouldn't put, just mid-tier, but you mentioned guys that are beneath Saquon Barkley in terms of the value of the position or the impact that he's going to have. But there's a calculation there. If I take my offensive line from, let's call it a D and being generous, if I take my offensive line from being a D and I make it a C plus this offseason, how much better does any running back look behind that line versus without? And even though we know that we can talk about manipulating cap and restructuring deals and what have you, if I put Saquon Barkley behind a D or D plus line because some guys take a step forward and Evan Neal plays to a 40 PFF grade rather than a 32, whatever it was, it still ends up being what we've seen in the past. Now, the one wrinkle I would put to this is the draft, other free agent moves. We're going to talk about Xavier McKinney versus other signings that they could make this offseason. We know that QB health and QB play and the wide receiver room, right, and other skill possessions, it all ties together. But it's just really hard. Other teams, if they had Saquon Barkley, might have a different discussion about do we keep Saquon or not. The Giants, unfortunately, have had one of the all-time worst offensive lines in the last 5 years. So I think that impacts it beyond everything else too, and makes it a very different discussion than if you're, I'm trying to think of a good example of a team that's like, I mean, frankly, the Cowboys did this a few years ago, right? Our offensive line is so good. Are we going to re-sign Zeke? The heck with it. Of course we are. And that worked for like a year and a half, and then it fizzled out. But it was easier to make that kind of call because you already had the success in place. And then, by the way, you saw allocation of funds. How did that start to deteriorate all of a sudden for them? And they had to make really difficult decisions and start shedding contracts to make room to pay for other players.
Adam, the other piece of it that you mentioned is the draft.
Oh, yeah.
If you think positional value, there isn't an NFL running back coming up in this draft that has, according to NFL Draft Buzz, a first round projection. They're all in the 50s, 60s, 80s, and 90s. If you're telling me that you can get a young, spry 23-year-old that's the third best running back in the draft and you get him in the third round, like look at Blake Corum from Michigan, who just won the national championship. If you can solidify your offensive line with Robert Hunt and use one of those additional picks that you have in the second round or the third round and get a Bucky Irving or a Blake Corum, don't you feel like that's a better allocation of resources when you think about how to build this team better?
Yeah, and you also have him. Listen, you have Eric Gray on the roster now. Is he good? Is he bad? Is he indifferent? Do you think he can improve? Was he subject to a bad offensive line? Of course, right? He's trying to develop. So I know that it's not the sexy answer, but it just feels like maybe 1 year, even if you choose to invest big in another free agent class a year or two from now, or go pretty high, second round pick on a running back over the next 2 seasons. Maybe that's the route that you go. But unfortunately, it just feels like they're at a bit of a crossroads here, and that's why in the end, Andy and I are both on the same page. I hate to say let Saquon walk, but ultimately, I think you let him go to market, set his table, spend your money elsewhere, lock yourself in, and then see if on the back end you can. Because by the way, a lot of people seem to pick up on this idea that Andy and I talked about on our last episode, restructuring Andrew Thomas, restructuring Dexter Lawrence. You can always go back to that and say, hey, what do the numbers need to look like here to maybe bring everybody underneath the roof? Go get a couple of big free agents and also retain Saquon Barkley and Xavier McKinney potentially as well. So we'll get into the Xavier McKinney side of it and also let Andy button up his closing thoughts on Saquon. But before we do that, though, friends, we got to remind you about our other friends. You can see it just behind the microphone. It's Manscaped. That's right, my guy. Andy knows about this. I know about this. Manscaped right now, where you can use our exclusive promo code OGP24 and get 20% off your order plus free shipping. It's letting you know that in 2024, you can go ahead and get yourself that New Year's resolution of keeping it clean, keeping it tidy, staying sharp. With Manscaped's new Lawnmower 5.0 Ultra, every man has a cheat code to looking good, feeling good, and turning the page of confidence in the new year. Now, Andy, we've asked this before, but I need to know. We're working our way. We're on the back end of February. By this point, all of your New Year's resolutions have officially collapsed in the embers of a fire, correct?
They have. They've just gone up in smoke completely.
Yeah. There's no reason really. Why bother? Why bother making excuses or trying to justify it? Andy tried his best, but ultimately he's having about, I don't know, 3 packs of Pall Malls a day, and he's really knocking down those jelly donuts. The bottom line is you can stick to a New Year's resolution of looking good when you go through the MVP of 24 Manscaped's 5th generation lawnmower. It's not just a trimmer, it's your grooming sidekick. It's equipped with 2 skin-safe guard blade heads and a standard one for taking a little bit off the top, and also a new foil blade to go smooth wherever your heart desires. It's like having a personal stylist at your fingertips, or, well, wherever you may want to go ahead and use that. And did we mention that it's waterproof? Because a trim in the shower is the only way to start your day. You go in there, you scrub up, you groom down, and then you're ready to roll. And for the men who want that full grooming experience, look no further than Manscaped's Performance Package 5.0. It's the grooming kit that you can get the trusted lawnmower, Manscaped ear and nose hair trimmer, and essential aftercare products with the Crop Soother Ball Aftershave. This is the one, guys. I think it's a little bit of a refresher down there if you catch my drift. And also the Crop Preserver Anti-Chafing Ball Deodorant. So get over to manscaped.com. Use 20% off code OGP24, and you'll also get free shipping on all your orders. It's an exclusive offer to us, manscaped.com. Promo code OGP24 for 20% off and free shipping. Go ahead and embrace a new you, and definitely embrace a new trimmer, courtesy of Manscaped. Manscaped. Gosh. I like being trimmed. I like looking good when I'm out there in the world, Andy. You know me. I'm a suave individual. Now, another suave individual might be Xavier McKinney, young buck, 24 years old, prime of his career, ready to get paid. Same scenario that you're going to introduce for us here. Lay out the table, lay out the numbers, and then lay out that other guy that could be on the market that maybe the Giants should pursue.
Yes, Adam. We talk about Xavier McKinney, and we talk about his negotiations. It feels like whenever you're talking about these free agents, the negotiation starts at the franchise tag because the agent looks at it and says, "Well, that's the starting point because that's the number if you want to keep us, and we're going to continue to go from there." And for Xavier McKinney, it's $16.2 million a year. Now, obviously, You've seen Xavier McKinney being very active on social media, saying, I work hard, I do my best. It's time for me to
Simply
get
the
paid. I'm one of
best.
the,
Yeah.
I'm top 5 at my position. I deserve top dollar for what I do. I'm young. I'm still growing. He's putting himself out there, making sure everybody knows that he deserves a very large paycheck. First
Sure
question
does.
is like, does any of this actually work? Like when people go out and they do like, I'm the best. Look at these numbers. I should get paid. Like, does it sway public opinion? Do you think it gets them more dollars? Like, does it matter at all?
I think it matters in like again, unfortunately, like in the PR landscape, it matters, right? Like, and I don't know, like it's weird because there's a finite number of guys in the NFL and sports that get like endorsement deals, right, and get to hawk products and stuff. So from that standpoint, I guess if you want to keep like your personality and your profile in a positive light, just like Saquon's trying to do, just like anybody is, then it makes sense to put out all the good vibes, right? I played great football. I've been dedicated. I played every single snap last year. So if you don't retain me, then the fan base can go, I can't believe you didn't keep him. You did him so dirty. We wish you nothing but the best, X, right? Like that's the net result. And by the way, in this age of social media, if you are a professional athlete, you're probably like, you know what? That actually matters. Because you know what I don't enjoy is getting absolutely dumped on day after day on all these platforms by internet trolls who are like, I can't believe you didn't take the money. You don't make enough, all that kind of crap. But from a Giants perspective, from a team perspective, I don't think it means much to the Giants because they're in the room. They've seen him. It may mean something for his agent and going to the market potentially to be able to say, hey, other teams around the NFL, you may have missed it. I am one of the best, both and safeties in the league, coverage and coming down to support in the run, right? There is a part of that where you're elevating your profile and just reminding the league of your age, your talent, and what your worth is.
Yeah, I do agree. Like, we do live in the day and age where like you get bombarded in your DMs from people being like, "I hate you for not signing something" or whatever. Like, you may as well try to win as many fans over so that you're like, "Look, I tried. Like, I told them that I was the best. Look at the money I'm getting."
Yep,
Um, when you talk about Xavier McKinney, he's only 24 years old. We talked
that's it.
about how this was really his breakout season. New defensive coordinator Shane Bowen thinks he can use him in a whole host of ways that maybe slightly differently than what Wink Martindale did. But we talk about the negotiation starting at 16.2 million. I kind of
6.2
feel
million
like
sold.
you're like, okay, sounds good. The Giants would obviously want to pay him what, 13 million ish would be a really happy number for them. He's going to want $19 million. So it feels like somewhere in the middle at 16 million is what he's going to be worth on the open market. So, Adam, let's say the number for Xavier McKinney is 16-ish million dollars a year on a 4-year deal. That's what I think is roughly what he's going to be worth on the open market. But again, these numbers could get crazy with people that have cap space. My question to you is this. Wide receiver for the Jacksonville Jaguars, Calvin Ridley, is a free agent this upcoming season. He is 29 years old. Pro Football Focus says that he will likely get a 2-year deal at about $16 and a half million a year with about 20 something million in guaranteed money. But so his contract is 2 years, whereas I think Xavier will get 4 years, but the average annual value is about the same.
Mm-hmm.
So put your GM hat on. Be Joe Schoen again. We know wide receiver is an area of need. If you can sign someone like Calvin Ridley on a shorter term deal, or you can go ahead and sign Xavier McKinney on a longer term deal at the safety position, where are you allocating your resources?
Yeah. So just at the top here, I wouldn't franchise tag Xavier McKinney. Just to be clear, I would sign him to a long-term deal, and I think that that's what the Giants are more likely to do here, simply because maybe you're right, 16 point something million dollars. Well, guess what? Let's sign you to a 4-year deal. Let's go ahead and make this first year cap hit relatively low, and we know we have big money coming to us over the next 2 and 3 seasons, so we can go ahead and spread that money out a little bit and soften the blow. Now, listen, we've seen Jamal Adams get paid big dollars, and a lot of times look the safety position, and a couple years later, you're thinking, boy, was that a mistake or not? Understandable, but the Giants only have so much talent, and you want to keep it in house. So that's the route that I think I would go with him if I was going to. So that is actually why I'm not going and spending that money on Calvin Ridley for a whole host of reasons. It's really not a knock on Calvin Ridley. It's just that I already have a guy in Wan'Dale Robinson. Go check out onegiantpodcast.com later this afternoon. You're going to see an article from me highlighting what he accomplished this past year. I think you already have talent in the room at the wide receiver position. You still need an elite number one. And guess what? That's what the draft is going to be for. So it's like a little bit of a peek behind the curtain here, where whether it's Malik Neighbors, whether it's a Dunze, right? Like there's options there at the top of the draft as well, where the Giants get that, as you've pointed out previously, cost control at a very expensive position. The short-term nature of the Calvin Ridley deal is interesting because it's not like a big investment. It's kind of like the Band-Aid, and you're allowed to reassess. But in my mind, I think it's long-term deal for Xavier McKinney, soften the money in the first couple of years of the contract, and address wide receiver in a different way. So maybe this would look different if you gave me a different other player to spend on. But where do you land on McKinney and spending it?
Great question.
Thank you.
It's tough to fault anyone investing in players that you know that are in your building, are a known commodity, are 24 years old, had their best career season, and theoretically wants to be here. I would not fault Joe Schoen for giving a multi-year, longer-term deal to someone like Xavier McKinney. It makes a ton of sense. Now the question is, can you get 80 cents on the dollar from Jason Pinnock and Dane Belton? Can you go get someone in the third round that can reshape that safety room? Adam, it is really difficult. If you think the Giants are going to spend significant draft capital on a quarterback in the first round and not address the wide receiver position, then you're talking about getting someone in the second round. Do we know if they're going to be an impact number one type wide receiver? At least with Calvin Ridley, 2 of the last 3 years, he's went over 1,000 yards. He can be that type of receiver. You talk about a 2-year deal, 29 years old. I still think he's in his prime. The next 2 years will probably be the end of it. The tread on the tires, it's almost like he's 28 because he sat out a year for that gambling fiasco that happened in Atlanta. So, does he have the same tread that someone else at his age does? The Giants have to address the wide receiver position. I think that they should do it in the first round of the NFL draft and get a guy that they can build with, whether it's Neighbors, whether it's Ndunze, or whether somehow Marvin Harrison Jr. falls to them. I think that's probably the place that I would go rather than Calvin Ridley. But there are other guys like Marquise Hollywood Brown is a 26-year-old free agent from Arizona. He is a guy that's been over 1,000 yards in his career. There are other players, like we've mentioned. Mike Evans is a free agent. Looks like T. Higgins won't hit the open market, but there are other guys that the Giants have options on. I do like the idea of a 6'1" Calvin Ridley being able to come in saying, "Hey, I'm a veteran. I can write the shit. I can lead here by example." And then there's obviously Gabe Davis, which I feel like is a conversation for maybe another day. Free agent, has familiarity with Brian Daboll, Joe Schoen, etc. It feels like he's going to get 13, maybe $14 million on the open market. But man, I think the Giants have to address it. But this is the whole point about allocating dollars and allocating resources to these positions of need. You're going to have to figure out the running back position with Saquon Barkley or elsewhere. You have to fix the offensive line. You have to get a wide receiver. Do you want to do it in free agency? Do you want to do it internally with someone like Xavier McKinney for the safety position? Or do you have to go into the draft and spend real big draft capital to address these decisions?
Yeah, again, and we when we highlighted earlier about restructuring contracts, that's where you open up some more flexibility, right? To say, how do we structure these deals? And again, it's funny to bring it back to Saquon Barkley. Well, if I say it's going to be a 4-year deal for Xavier McKinney, and we're going to make that money kind of work for us, and I'd like to sign Saquon Barkley to a 3-year deal, the fact that maybe that's effectively 2 years for Saquon and effectively 3 years with an out for Xavier McKinney, as all NFL contracts are written on the back of a napkin in terms of, concrete nature. So you're also talking about, again, putting band-aids on the franchise in the short term and understanding that maybe our real window to start having success on the field is going to be another season away. We highlighted Daniel Jones' contract, and that after year 3 is really the easy out without having any damage to the cap or out taking on any dead cap money. So Joe Schoen in the background is working on all of these different angles and also trying to know that talking about, well, another 2 seasons. Well, another 2 seasons, another GM is probably making these decisions, right? So he's trying to do the both and that's where I think paying some of your internal guys makes sense, and then finding a way to spend on the open market is going to make sense too. Cornerback is another position that they're going to have to look at here. And really what this also crystallizes, because we're going to do conversations like this around the other key positions of need that don't even involve in-house guys, but it keeps crystallizing. The Giants have 10 key positions of need going into this free agency and this draft class. And they're not all going to be home run hits. Somebody's going to get taken in the 5th or 6th round, and you're going to hope that they can be a spark. You're going to hope that they can come and contribute. Somebody's going to get signed in free agency at a low-cost, team-friendly 1-year deal because they're coming off an injury or they weren't as productive, and you're going to hope that they hit, because that's the way that this team is going to be successful. And maybe Calvin Ridley fits that a little bit here, because when you put him up against some of the other wide receivers on the market, this is why you brought his name up. Because it feels like he's $4, $5, $6 million below another tier of wide receiver that, relative to production, you might get, talk about percentage, you might get 98% production at what, 65% the cost by signing Calvin Ridley. That's what makes him very intriguing, certainly for the Giants here when it comes to the free agency class.
At the end of the day, Adam, I feel like we've seen what the offense looks like when you pay Saquon Barkley $10+ million and the offensive line isn't good, right? I feel like we've seen that before. It didn't look great last year. It hasn't really produced successful winning records for the Giants. We've seen what Xavier McKinney can do, and we think that he may have another level that he can aspire to achieve to with the Giants. So I think you and I are both in agreement, in these different scenarios. Paying Xavier McKinney, investing in a 24-year-old up-and-coming, emerging defensive player makes a ton of sense. And addressing the offensive line, if you're going to spend $10 million somewhere on offense, it feels like the offensive line is the place to go.
Classic closeout question here. Do you think that the Giants do it all? Do you think that the Giants restructure contracts, open up money, and they go out in this offseason and they say, we're bringing back Saquon on a 3-year deal. We're bringing back McKinney on a 4-year deal. We're going out to market and signing Robert Hunt. We're going out. We'll bring up the other name that I had mentioned, Bryce Huff. We're going and signing him from the New York Jets, and he's going to come in and help Kayvon Thibodeau on the defensive side. Do you think it's possible that they do make a bit of a all-in-ish type of move here, at least on both sides of the ball, and then say, and we know, big question mark at the QB spot, but we're going to make the team as good as we can going into 2024?
I don't anticipate that being the case. I don't think Joe Schoen has shown historically that he's willing to push all the chips in and, mortgage the future for right now, especially with all the question marks that are at quarterback. But I wouldn't be surprised if some of the scenarios that we laid out, if he decides to pick and choose a la carte off the menu to say, this doesn't hurt us in the long term. Investing in these young players makes sense. Investing in the offensive line is something that we continue to strive for each and every day. So maybe I take a little bit of everything, and that's how we start building this team together.
When we come back on Friday, we'll start to look at these positions and say, okay, it's not Calvin Ridley or any of the top 4 or 5 wide receivers. Is there a bargain player on the free agent market that they could add into the wide receiver room? We'll address the continuing speculation that Darius Slayton should be cut. That's not right. We'll explain to you what is the correct path forward with him. Likewise, in the running back room, across the offensive line, right? All these key positions. We're going to go down a little bit deeper into the free agency market before we turn our attention in the weeks ahead to obviously the draft, the scouting combine, and starting to find some of these diamonds in the rough. The way that you stay informed about that, you get over to not only YouTube and One Giant Podcast, but also onegiantpodcast.com. The website is live. And as I mentioned, you will find an article about the current key 3 members of the wide receiving core, Slayton, Robinson, and Hyatt, right up on them. We'll have it coming in the running back room as well. So additional content for you over on onegiantpodcast.com. We remind you to go check out our friends at Manscaped and use our promo code OGP24. And if I could just let you know, get over to Pietential, Pietential.com, and go ahead and give yourself a nice little self-assessment tool free for individual users. Go ahead and check in on where your wellness is. Set some benchmarks to go ahead and have success going forward and track that progress so that you know if you're a guy like Saquon and you've been having a bit of a hard time determining whether or not your franchise cares about you, at least you know that you're doing good for yourself. Pietential.com. Oh, man. And Andy Mac 214 on Twitter, at Adam Arbrecht as well, and at One Giant Podcast. Guys. We're doing it all. Thank you so much for being part of the episode. We will see you again on Friday. And until next time, it's Andrew Mackowitz with Want, Need, and Nay. Demand the people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.